Good morning from Washington, D.C. Exactly 1 year ago, Russia decided to invade Ukraine. Since then, the world has changed. On the occasion of the 1-year anniversary of this war, the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and the Policy Center for the New South, in cooperation with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, are unveiling today their twin reports, Russia's Influence in Africa, a Security Perspective. For the first time, and given the large area of the Russian influence in Africa, an Africa Center report is published in English and in French. For the Policy Center, it's not unusual. The Policy Center for the New South is a Moroccan think tank with a leading role in Africa, aiming to contribute to the improvement of economic and social public policies that challenge Morocco and the rest of Africa, as integral parts of the Global South, of course. As such, the Policy Center brings together researchers, publishes their work, and capitalizes on a network of renewed partners among the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, representative of different regions of the world. The most important Policy Center gatherings are the annual international conferences, the Atlantic Dialogues, and African Peace and Security Annual Conference, APSACO. The exceptional report we launched today is co-authored by Africa Center Fellow Sarah Daly and Policy Center Fellow Abdelhak Bassou. The outbreak of the war in Ukraine has placed a spotlight on Russia-Africa relations and subsequent implications on the global geopolitical stage. 17 African nations abstained in the March 2022 UN General Assembly vote to condemn Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. This vote, coupled with the growing influence of the BRICS, chaired this year by South Africa, has sent a clear signal to the US and its allies that Russia is a strong competitor with deep-rooted and strategic ties on the African continent. With the withdrawal of French Barkhane and European Tabuka forces, the growing role of the mercenary Wagner Group in the Sahel, a region hit by recent military coup in Mali and Burkina Faso, marks a significant change in the region. Meanwhile, the economic consequences of the war in Ukraine are worsening the humanitarian situation on the ground by increasing energy prices and ongoing food insecurity. Yet, Africa remains a crucial player in this new geopolitical order because of its natural resources and emerging business opportunities. Following the promising US-Africa Leaders Summit in December last year, a Russia-Africa Summit will occur after a 4-year hiatus, and a BRICS Summit will also happen this year. What are the Russia's goals in Africa? What are African expectations of this relationship? What will be the United States' answer to Russian influence in Africa? What kind of cooperation should be set up with French and European allies? To answer these tremendously important questions, I would like to welcome the authors who will be interviewed by Chris Condon, journalist at Bloomberg News, who just returns from US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's recent African tour. Following the presentation of the report, a keynote speech by Africom Major General Ekman and a high-profile expert panel will discuss their recommendations and will feature Natalia Bugayova, Russia Fellow, Institute for the Study of War, Ovigbe Egegu, Policy Analyst at the Development Reimagined, Michael Shurkin, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Africa Center, and Petr Tuma, Senior Fellow at our Friends of Europe Center. As for you and the audience, please submit your questions in the chat. Chris will ask them to our speakers before the closing remarks of this exceptional event be provided by Atlantic Council board member and former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Frank Kramer. Thank you all for joining us today. Before we dive into this exciting conversation, please welcome with me my dear friend, Dr. Karim El Ainaoui, Executive President of the Policy Center for the New South. Karim is also Executive Vice President of the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University and Dean of its Social Sciences, Economics, and Humanities Cluster. He's an economist who worked at the Central Bank of Morocco, where he held the position of Director of Economics, Statistics, and International Relations. Previously, he worked for 8 years at the World Bank as an economist for its regional units of the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Africa. Karim El Ainaoui is a prominent author who holds advisory positions at various institutions, including as advisor to the CEO and chairman of OCP Group, Dr. Terab. I feel honored to co-sign the foreword of these excellent twin reports we will discuss today. Karim, over to you.
Many thanks, Anna, and it's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations to you, your team at the Africa Center for great organization and also your commitment to Africa's development and the future and its relation with the rest of the world. I will be very brief and I won't get into the details of the report as I'm not a specialist, but I want to share a little bit of the spirit and the why we are doing this together and in what kind of spirit we are here in Morocco and in Africa in general, which is tightly linked to the topic of the paper that will be discussed. First of all, there's high entropy in the system and risks are rising. Complexity is being faced by policymakers. We have risks of fragmentation. We have the consequences of the rivalries on the continent, which could be an opportunity, but often comes with risks. And the continent is also facing macroeconomic pressures, particularly in its fiscal policy and as well as monetary policy, and several countries have actually already entered in agreements with the IMF. So if you combine all that and of course interventions of foreign powers, be it Russia and others, and here it is Russia that we are looking at, they're adding to this complexity. So what we could do as think tanks, we are not policymakers, is exactly what we're doing together, which is creating a platform using research, our convening power, to shed light on those complexity and foster dialogue and try to create a space of reasonable discussion to happen within these multiple and many actors. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do here. It's, of course, a small contribution, but I think an important contribution. And what Morocco values in Africa in general is its capacity to have reasonable discussions with its partners, and that are also aligning their intentions, their values with their acts. And I think today, as we are facing these many risks, this dangerous sort of set of challenges facing policymakers, values are very important. I think Morocco and the rest of Africa have been quite clear, and that's actually one of the readings I have of the vote at the United Nations that has sent strong waves around the world. One of the interpretations is actually a signal, in a way, to deepen our dialogue and to sort of send a message with no fundamental consequences beyond its psychological impact to reset a little bit the nature of the dialogue that we have, the whole of multilateralism, international law, and what we do with it, and with respect with our relation with Africa in general. So, in a nutshell, this is what I wanted to share with you. We are coming here to you with, of course, expertise, as Abdelhak Bassou will present his paper with his colleague, co-author, but also with values, with the commitment with respect to the future and values that we share with America and our traditional partners. I think it is very important. As think tanks, we have an important role to cultivate, to nurture those values, to share them with the young generation, and to make them a fundamental pillar of our relation, our partnership. Thank you very much.
Karim, you are right to mention the young generations. I remember at the last APSACO in Rabat last summer, you specified that the policy center is structured through very young experts. Most of them are more than 35 years old. So thank you for mentioning that point and for this inspiring and important opening remarks, introducing the context of this timely report. Now it's time to give the floor to the authors, Mr. Basu and Ms. Dali. Thank you again, Chris, for this important interview. Over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. It really is my honor to introduce two distinguished guests who have prepared two very interesting reports about this topic. To my left, first is Sarah Daly. She is a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, specializing in African geopolitical and security developments. Former Fulbright scholar, Sarah is also a researcher at the Institute for Defense Analyses in Alexandria, and she is currently pursuing further graduate studies at Yale University. Abdelhak Basu is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, specializing in security, strategy, and defense studies. He's also an affiliate professor at the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Ben Guerir, Morocco. Abdelhak, let's start with you and the report that you put together here. Tell us about the most important conclusions. And I'm particularly interested in, while we're talking about Russia's influence in Africa, you're both very much focused on what's happening in the war in Ukraine. Why is that?
Vous êtes très intéressé dans la guerre qui prend lieu actuellement entre la Russie et l'Ukraine. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous en parler?
Oui. Pourquoi est-ce qu'on ne peut pas parler de la relation de la Russie avec les pays africains sans parler de la guerre d'Ukraine?
The reason for which we cannot speak of the relationship between Russia and the African countries without speaking also and taking a close look at the war in Ukraine as follows.
Parce que la guerre d'Ukraine, d'une part, il n'est pas terminé, mais il aura certainement un impact sur toutes les parties du monde et sur l'ordre mondial et sur la marche du monde.
And while the war in Ukraine is not yet over, certainly it will have a strong impact on the entire world, and the outcomes are still uncertain.
La deuxième raison pourquoi nous parlons de la guerre d'Ukraine, parce que la partie sécuritaire et militaire est la partie la plus importante dans la relation de la Russie avec les pays africains.
Another reason that we bring up the topic of Ukraine is that the relationship, the military and security relationship between Russia and Africa is really the core of Russia's influence in Africa.
Pour ce qui concerne mon papier, la question essentielle est de savoir quel impact aura cette guerre en Ukraine sur les relations militaires entre la Russie et certains pays africains.
And so the crux of my paper is the question, what is this war in Ukraine? What will be the impact on the relationship between Russia and a number of different African nations?
Une précision que je voudrais faire avant de continuer, c'est que je parle de pays africains, je ne parle pas de l'Afrique.
And I would like it to be noted that I make a distinction between African countries and not Africa?
Parce que le dialogue, les réactions ou les interactions avec la Russie sont décidées par chaque pays. Ce n'est pas l'Afrique qui décide. Donc il n'y a pas une décision unique et unie.
And the reason for this is that any decisions, any relationship between Russia and Africa is taken country by country. It is not on a continental level. And each country has a very unique relationship with Russia.
Maintenant, pour répondre à la question de l'impact de la guerre d'Ukraine, nous avons voulu, dans le papier, d'abord connaître la nature de la relation militaire entre la Russie et les pays africains.
And so before we speak of the impact on this war of Ukraine on African countries, we wanted to take a look at the relationship and the context of Russia's influence in different African countries.
Et nous découvrons que la première intervention russe ou intervention militaire russe en Afrique ne date que de la dernière décennie du 19e siècle.
And we realized that the very first military intervention from Russia on the African continent only really was at the end of the last century.
La Russie est alors
The 19th century, pardon.
La Russie est alors intervenue pour aider l'Éthiopie contre l'Italie.
At which time Russia had intervened to bring assistance to Ethiopia against Italy.
Parce que l'Italie était alliée avec la Grande-Bretagne.
After an alliance between Italy and Great Britain.
Et la Russie ne voulait pas stratégiquement que l'Angleterre ait un pont entre ses colonies de la Méditerranée et ses colonies de l'océan Indien.
And Russia did not want Great Britain to have this strategic bridge between its colonies in the Mediterranean arena and its colonies in the Indian Ocean.
Ensuite, lorsque il y a eu la révolution bolchevique et l'URSS, nous allons remarquer que l'Afrique n'était pas un point très important pour l'URSS.
And it's to be noted that until the revolution and the advent of the USSR, that Africa and its countries were not of great import or interest to Russia.
Staline jugeait les révolutionnaires africains comme des gens qui ne supportent pas la révolution universelle et mondiale.
In Stalin's eyes, the African revolutionaries were not supportive of the concept of a universal worldwide revolution.
Il leur reprochait de ne s'intéresser qu'à la libération de l'Afrique et qu'ils étaient prêts à négocier avec l'Ouest leur indépendance.
And that the African countries were only interested in their own individual liberations, and they were even ready to negotiate with the West to reach their goals.
Ce n'est que sous Khrouchtchev que l'URSS va s'intéresser à l'Afrique parce que, après la conférence de Bandung, la Russie s'est occupée d'arrêter l'expansion de la Chine maoïste.
It is only under Khrushchev that the USSR intervened with a conference of Bandung, and the purpose of that was to put the brakes on China's influence on the African continent.
La Russie a donc jugé, l'URSS plutôt, a donc jugé utile d'intervenir, d'aider les mouvements de révolution en Afrique pour contrer à la fois l'influence chinoise et pour aider ces mouvements contre l'Occident.
So the interest of the USSR at this time was twofold. It was not just to put the brakes on the Chinese influence, but it was also a means to thwart the West in Africa and its intentions.
Après le démantèlement de l'URSS, on a eu à peu près 15 ans de non-intérêt pour l'Afrique avec Boris Yeltsin.
So after the implosion of the Soviet Union under Boris Yeltsin, there was a period of about 15 years where Russia was totally disengaged with Africa.
C'est Poutine, le président Poutine, qui a la nostalgie de la Russie puissante.
And it's Putin with his nostalgia for a very strong Russia.
Il a la nostalgie de la Russie tsariste et la nostalgie de l'URSS, de la grandeur de la Russie.
He has the nostalgia of the Tsarist Russia, the power of the Tsarist Russia, as well as the power of the Soviet Union.
Au niveau militaire, il va dès 2006 effacer la dette de l'Algérie et de la Libye, la dette militaire, qui était à peu près de 5 milliards de dollars, contre de nouveaux contrats militaires.
And so, starting as early as 2006 on the military level, Putin erased the debt, the military debt, both of Algeria and Libya, which was valued at about $5 billion. He totally erased that military debt, but in exchange for new contracts.
Et le point le plus haut de cette relation militaire de la Russie avec l'Afrique nous vient après le sommet de Sochi.
And the high point of this military relationship between the new Russia and Africa came after the Sochi summit.
Le sommet de Sochi en 2019, la Russie va se présenter en Africain comme une puissance militaire qui a réussi contre le terrorisme au Moyen-Orient et qui a réussi à maintenir un président qui était déjà sur la voie de la décadence.
And with the Sochi summit in 2019, Russia succeeded in showing their strong military might and also their ability to fight terrorism and to protect and maintain a leader in power.
C'est pour cela que nous posons la question, est-ce que lors du prochain sommet à Saint-Pétersbourg en juillet, est-ce que la Russie aura le même succès avec les Africains malgré les vulnérabilités révélées par la guerre d'Ukraine?
So the question is, at the new summit coming in St. Petersburg, will Russia still enjoy this past military recognition and admiration, considering its military defeats or lack of success in Ukraine currently?
That seems like, if I may just interject, a good jumping off point. We've brought us right up to the present. Sarah, how would you answer that question? And in that context, do you think it's fair? Of course, none of us welcome this invasion, but can we characterize this war in Ukraine as an opportunity for the West in terms of countering Russia in Africa?
I think certainly, as Dr. Basu describes, Russia really grew its presence on the continent through its security relationships after 2015 and right into the 2020s. But with the invasion of Ukraine, I think they've revealed some vulnerabilities both on the supply side and the demand side of that security relationship. Their somewhat lackluster performance in Ukraine, in addition to the poor and problematic performance of their PMCs in these counterterrorism operations across the Sahel and Mozambique and other places, I think might dampen the desire of some of the African nations and leaders to seek those services in the first place, which certainly presents an opportunity for other providers of security assistance, including the US and other Western nations, to re-engage or redouble their existing engagements in countries where the security threats have really not subsided, even though there is an ongoing conflict elsewhere in the world. Yeah.
The Biden administration just hosted its own very large Africa summit in Washington, December. Do you applaud that start in terms of re-engaging in Africa? And is this, what else should the US and other Western countries be doing to take advantage of this moment in time then? Both of you, please.
Alors, lors du sommet récent aux États-Unis, est-ce que tout d'abord, les États-Unis avec les pays de l'Afrique, est-ce que tout d'abord vous souteniez l'effort du président Biden de se faire? Et que pensez-vous pourront être les opportunités justement actuellement pour l'Occident de renforcer ses relations avec les pays de l'Afrique dans ce milieu?
Je crois que ce que les Africains, ce qui pourrait amener les Africains à être du côté de la Russie ou de la Chine.
I think what could bring the African countries to side with China or Russia.
Contrairement aux États-Unis, la Russie ne pose aucune question sur les valeurs, sur les droits de l'homme, sur la démocratie. Il ne pose aucune question.
Contrary to the United States, Russia and China present no obstacles and no issues with human rights abuses or anything to do with any humanitarian issues.
La deuxième question, moi je parle du côté militaire surtout, c'est que tous les experts nous disent que l'armement russe est moins cher que l'armement occidental et américain.
So on the other hand, I've been told, strictly from a military perspective, is that Russian weapons supposedly are far less expensive to African countries than those coming from the United States or from other Western nations.
Et en Afrique, nous avons encore des mouvements de libération, ANC, ZANU-PF, FLN en Algérie, qui sont encore dans l'esprit révolutionnaire et du contre-Occident.
And there's still today in Africa revolutionary movements such as the ANC or the FLM who are still seeking to fight their own revolutions.
D'ailleurs, même quand nous avons parlé Madame l'ambassadeur a parlé des votes à l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies, beaucoup de pays africains ont voté contre les résolutions qui condamnent la Russie, juste parce qu'ils ne veulent pas voter avec les États-Unis, parce que c'est l'Occident, juste contre, anti-américanisme.
And as the ambassador mentioned earlier, there was a number of African nations at the UN General Assembly who refused to vote to condemn Russia's incursion attack on Ukraine strictly because they did not want to be aligned with the United States or with the West. So it was strictly an anti-US and anti-West gesture.
La disposition, c'est-à-dire l'initiative du président Biden est à apprécier vis-à-vis des Africains et nous espérons que vraiment cette initiative sera l'opportunité pour les États-Unis de reprendre la main en Afrique.
And President Biden's initiative with the US-Africa Summit is greatly appreciated by many African nations, and we can only hope that this presages a new era where the United States will engage more fully on the African continent.
Sarah, I want to also give you a chance to speak to this point about the U.S. and Western engagement and what they're doing right or wrong at this point.
I completely agree. I think it's a really great step in the right direction for the U.S. to re-engage and rebuild its relationships because the needs are still there. You know, we share a lot of common goals with our African partners, including a desire for human security, for economic prosperity. And I think Russia's distraction in Ukraine provides us even more opportunity to step in and perhaps fill gaps that may have been left or in some cases created by Russian engagement on the continent.
One additional question for you. Dr. Basu mentioned that Russia's engagement explicitly does not come attached with conditions, expectations for governance or human rights. On the U.S. side, on the Western side, does that mean to compete for influence, these governments need also not attach conditions, or is that possible? How do we balance that out?
I think threading this needle is incredibly important, but I would certainly not advocate that we abandon our commitment to human rights and good governance and promoting democracy, because those are incredibly important, particularly on the security side, to promoting human security in the long term. I think it's a great opportunity for the research assets of places like the Policy Center for New South or Atlantic Council to step in and provide assistance about how can we rethink the mechanisms we currently use that perhaps were built and designed for a time when there wasn't alternative options for partners to pursue either in the private sector or through other countries, to think about how we can thread that needle appropriately.
Okay. Our time has been very short, but thank you so much to both of you for your excellent contributions here. Ambassador, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Chris. You stay with us, of course, for the next step. But first, I would like to thank Abdelak Basu and Sarah Deli for the presentation of their twin reports. I know it was short, but the report will be available online. And we will send it to our Atlantic Council community, so they will have full access to your report. So thank you very much, and the discussion will continue around your report with a high-profile expert panel moderated by Chris Condon as well. But before, I would like to give the floor to Major General Kenneth Ekman, who will speak on behalf of the U.S. Africom, one of the 11 combatant commands of the Department of Defense based in Germany, but responsible for U.S. military operations in Africa. General Ekman.
Well, good morning in Washington, D.C. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments from United States Africa Command on the U.S. military approach to Africa, to include addressing the impacts of Russian influence. Congratulations to Ms. Daly and Dr. Basu on the release of their important and timely reports. United States Africa Command is privileged to work in 21st century partnership with African militaries. We employ our limited personnel, resources, and programs to execute a partner-led, U.S.-enabled approach to achieve shared security objectives for America and African nations. We respect and uphold the sovereignty and agency of each country. This includes appreciating that Africans have a choice in trusted security partners. While the United States has much to offer, many African militaries have strong, long-standing defense relationships with a variety of nations. These include our strategic competitors consisting of China and Russia. In United States Africa Command, we do not want to force our African partners to make a choice. However, we do want them to be forewarned. The U.S. national security strategy has been clear about U.S. objectives to outcompete our pacing threat, China, and constrain our acute threat, Russia. We will cooperate where we can on shared challenges such as climate and energy security, pandemics and biodefense, and food insecurity. We are also clear-eyed about the destabilizing and adverse effects our competitors have on the free, open, and stable international order. In some parts of Africa, that order is at risk. That order enables African sovereignty and democracy, the free flow of global commerce, and the protection of natural resources in the land and maritime domains. Yet, in Africa, our strategic competitors, particularly Russia, have had a strong and negative effect on African nations and on U.S. access and influence on the African continent. As in Ukraine, the illegal and destructive activities conducted by Russian private military companies, like the Wagner Group, have undermined democracies, violated human rights, and extracted resources at the expense of their African hosts. Furthermore, Russian Wagner's strong disinformation campaign with Russian gray zone activities has denied African governments and the societies they represent the ability to make informed choices. In Sudan, Central African Republic, Mozambique, Mali, Libya, and other locations, Russian Wagner presence and activities are contrary to U.S. military objectives in Africa. Wagner earned the executive order designating it as a transnational criminal organization. They must be constrained. For U.S. Africa Command, disrupting Russian malign activity on the continent occurs against a backdrop of security cooperation serving both U.S. and African needs. Specifically, the U.S. military maintains the strategic access and influence that comes with our alliances and partnerships to build African partner capacity. In accordance with our national defense strategy, we prioritize disrupting violent extremist organizations, those threats alongside our African partners, for the threat that they pose to African security and ours. We are prepared to respond to crises on the continent, including risk to our U.S. embassies and to disasters at the request of African nations. Finally, we bolster the security efforts of our allies, multilateral organizations, and regional bodies, contributing to a whole-of-government approach by the U.S. focused on harmonizing diplomacy, development, and defense. We also champion cross-cutting initiatives using defense relationships as entry points. These include climate resilience and change mitigation, women, peace, and security, and the U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability. I hope it's clear to African nations that all of these efforts support African security, stability, and prosperity. I also hope it's clear to the attendees of this wonderful forum. While I have highlighted U.S. Africa Command and whole-of-government efforts, these occur in concert with the contributions of non-government organizations, academia, and commercial entities. As the recent African Leaders Summit reflected, 21st century partnership is whole-of-nation partnership. Our collective approach and the values that underpin it truly constitute America's competitive advantage. Thank you for giving United States Africa Command the opportunity to address this important forum. Congratulations again to the Atlantic Council on today's release of your important reports. I hope that the rest of today's discussions go well.
Thank you once again to Major General Ekman for those remarks. It's my pleasure now to introduce a new panel of speakers, beginning with someone joining us remotely. Ovigwe Egwegu is a policy analyst at Development Reimagined, a consultancy and research firm focused on international development, trade, diplomacy, the environment, and public relations. His work includes research and strategic advice on geoeconomics and security in Africa. From my left, Michael Shurkin is a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, an expert in European defense and West African politics and security. He is an adjunct professor at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Natalia Bugayova is a non-resident fellow at the Institute for the Study of War, where she previously led the Russia and Ukraine research team. Her work focuses on the analysis of Russia's military and information operations globally from Eastern Europe to Africa. And last but certainly not least, Petr Tuma is a visiting fellow at the Council's Europe Center, a career diplomat for his native Czech Republic. He previously taught philosophy and anthropology at Charles University in Prague. Natalia, I'd like to start with you. You heard the remarks from Dr. Basu. Could you speak a little bit more about the role that Africa plays in the Kremlin's overall strategy, who is driving this, and to what end?
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'll start by saying that the Kremlin's investments in Africa, despite their limited scope, have always been strategic. They weren't opportunistic or incidental, and despite a very large degree of freelancing, they've actually been driven by Kremlin, which was trying to use Africa to offset some of the limits of Russia's power, be it trying to get new revenue sources or expand its military base on cheap, and probably most important, actually use Africa in some of Russia's information operations to try to posture as a great power. And it's one of the reasons why the Kremlin, and we see Lavrov still prioritizing Africa, as they're undeniably tied up in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is because Africa is still one of the few places where Russia can try to project its image over global power, despite the fact that its real power is eroding and it's losing influence, even if in its core theater in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The second quick point I'd like to make is that, look, Russia's value proposition in Africa have always been niche, but they've done a lot with little, in part because they've amplified the package that authoritarian leaders are interested in, be it physical security or societal control or energy or food, with a lot of investment in human networks and information operations. And one of the reasons we know Wagner so well is because it's meant to be so public. It is part of Russian information operations. So I think the war in Ukraine will change Russia's the effect of Russian investment in Africa, and some of their efforts actually been not successful. They still have not gotten any basing that they've been trying to do for years and years, but some of their investments paid off, including in the information realm, and the fact that African nations are not still very hesitant to condemn Russia's invasion or join sanctions is actually, I think, a result of a very long-standing investment in the information operations on the continent.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You said Russia does a lot with very little. Petr, can you comment on that? And something else that we spoke about last week, you said that Russia shines where the West is weak in Africa. Expand on that a little bit. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I think it's related to the weak cards Russia is holding. And it's the modus operandi we can observe for some time already. I had a chance to be in Syria just ahead of their interventions in spring 2015, and in Bamako in summer 2021, ahead of the Russian, I would say, geopolitical coup. And what was in common was the weakness of Europe, of the West, both in Syria and in Bamako at that time, and the way how they played it with very few with very few cards in the pocket. And that's also something what I think they might replicate. That's a lesson learned we have to take and look around where this can happen again. Now probably Burkina Faso is a country to watch, where the junta is sitting on the fence, if I may say so. And Russia, again, sees that France is withdrawing. Europeans are not strong, and they can score geopolitical points there. Thus, Europe has to learn from its mistakes done mainly in neighboring Mali, and I would say two, 3 points: strengthen our messaging, the Stratcom. In Mali, I'd say it was intentional that we kept low profile. Brussels and some European countries decided that it would be better. I think now we are waking up, and that's the Russian war against Ukraine, who helped to raise the importance of the Stratcom. So the Stratcom team in Brussels, in the European External Service, is opening or launching its unit on Africa. That's one thing, we have to be active. And we heard complaints, it was in summer 2021, before the second coup in Mali, that Europeans are not delivering arms, and that the weak mandate of the EUTM, European Training Mission there. So I think if we want to keep government in Burkina where it is, I think they want to play us both, Russians and Europeans and the West. We have to deliver them something. We have to help them with some weapons. We all know that it's not about weapons, it's not about the military which win the solution of the situation, but they have to score some points for its population, and then we can work with them farther on, you know. And then the development projects, infrastructure projects. It's not only about aid, humanitarian aid. The EU does it well, but you know, I sense that in Africa, the political alignment goes with the countries which are investing, which are having infrastructure, which are working with elites, and thus we have to invest. We have there the global gateway, which might help European companies to further invest. That's the way how we can probably keep Burkina where it is now.
Now, speaking of Western investment and engagement, Michael, I was just on a trip with the Secretary of the Treasury to Africa. She went to several African countries. She spoke a lot about fostering U.S. investment and engagement across the continent. And I asked her, well, this is all very nice, very reasonable, but let's put this into the context of the competition for influence with Russia and China. And she wouldn't have any of that. She said, no, that is not the reason for my trip. This is not about competition. With respect to the Secretary, do you believe that?
With respect to the Secretary, I have to say not entirely. I do think that the U.S. government has figured out that it's in its best interest when trying to compete with Russia and China, that perhaps the best thing it should do is not talk about Russia and China, right? And to make this case, like, we're not talking about Russia and China, we're not here because of China. They shouldn't use the word at all, and to just sort of sell this idea that we're interested in Africa for Africa's sake. Is it true? It's debatable. I think generally speaking it isn't true, just given the fact that the United States government has other priorities, and that I think we've always struggled to, as a government, to find reasons to be interested in the African continent. Now, somebody who cares a lot about Africa, I think it's too bad, because I care about Africa for Africa's sake, but I also see that in the United States government in general, we have other priorities. We're thinking about China, we're thinking about Russia, we're thinking about Ukraine, we're not thinking about stabilizing Africa or helping African development. So it becomes something of an afterthought. I do think that what she's saying is what she should be saying, right? So I applaud her for saying that, even if, you know, I take it with a measure of salt.
Okay. Ovigwe, I'd like to bring you in here on a couple of points. Dr. Basu mentions in his report, he says of Russia, for the czars, Soviets, and Putin, Africa is a theater for confronting the West and countering European projects. Well, for the West, is Africa anything different than a theater for confronting its own rivals? And what else should it be then?
Yeah, first of all, thank you all for the opportunity to speak and share my thoughts on this very important issue. Now, to your question, how the West or Russia sees Africa, I think both countries they tend to have the same attitude towards the continent in terms of it being a theater for competition. If you look at the U.S. National Defense Strategy released under Trump, that was very stated clearly how the United States is going to compete with Russia and China, across the world. If you look at the recent one that came out late last year as well, it still underlines that same view of competition. And to a large extent, that is very problematic, because for African countries, when you talk about great power competition, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is the Cold War, which many people will agree was a very hot war for regions like Africa because of the proxy wars and destabilization. In fact, most of all the coups we're talking about were actually, most of the coups have happened in that context. So there is a lot of concern when great powers are looking at Africa as a playing field, as opposed to how they can work, bilaterally and with using multilateral institutions to actually address the issues on the ground. Previous week, I just mentioned the fact that there needs to be development needs of African countries have to be addressed. And if you look at the countries in particular, we're talking about Russia's influence today, it is very clear that they have really serious developmental needs. By HDI 2022, of the 10 lowest countries that have, in terms of HDI, Chad is not second lowest. Niger followed by number 3, CAR, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea. So there is no question that the stagnation, the underdevelopment of this region is not just an issue of destabilization. It drives the destabilization, and of course, that would lead to a lot of people questioning what have been the benefit of long-term partnerships if after decades we still have such poor outcomes.
Thank you. Pedro, I'm wondering if you could also weigh in, before we talk more about some of the broad issues, that there's a lot going on in the Sahel region. Just this past couple of days, we've seen some more violence. Is that somehow an emblematic conflict in terms of Russia's engagement following some withdrawal from the French, and what does that teach us about what else is going on across the continent?
Sahel, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. If I remember Lavrov, was it Lavrov who said that Mali is a carrier ship for their geopolitical interests in the region? So it might be taken by Russians as a model, as a launchpad for broader engagement. But I think, to come back to what we discussed during my first intervention here, I think that Russians are opportunists. They are waiting for weak spots. They are looking for cracks. They put the water into the crack, let it freeze, and once it's opened more, they put more water. And they have several cracks like this in Africa, and they are waiting. They are waiting when the crack will open. They have Central African Republic. They are doing pretty well in Sudan, and if this will be connected, they can go to farther on. Then now they are connecting Mali, Guinea, and Burkina. So I think it's kind of a modus operandi we can observe there. And if I may, I'd say that Central and Eastern European countries might play a role there. Now, once we had an issues with colonial burden of the Europe, and with other Stratcom as well. So we have countries like France and UK who has a great deal of knowledge about the country. But then on the other side, and it's related to the war on Ukraine, we have countries which don't have this burden, know the Russians, even suffered under the Soviet yoke. Have some limited knowledge of the Africa, were there during 70s, 80s, can offer infrastructure projects or limited projects, and if we pair together, like with Brits or in Stratcom or with French on the other side or on the delivery of the arms, we heard before that Russian arms are way cheaper than the Westerns. So we saw now in war of the Ukraine that Central and Eastern European countries were able to channel the Soviet-designed weapons, cheaper arms, refurbish them to Ukraine. So I think the similar model might be used for some of the African countries to counter Russian influence.
Natalia, I'd like to ask you about another related topic. At the bottom, the question is whether the U.S. and Western powers make a mistake by running around and wagging their finger at African governments, warning them not to, for instance, while this war is going on in Ukraine, warning against engaging with Russia economically, militarily. And we've seen South Africa, as one of our viewers has noted, has just engaged in military naval exercises with Russia and China. So that seems to have been very productive. Is the U.S. making a mistake in threatening punitive action against governments that engage with Russia or China in ways that it does not like?
Yeah, thanks. First, I actually want to build on the point about the opportunism in Mali, because Russia has been very heavily invested in that region since 2016. And while I agree they do use opportunities when they present themselves, it has been, I think, a very big blind spot of the West to ignore Russian trivial activities at the tactical level and until they become strategic gains. In terms of your question, no, I think the core question should be what our interests are and what of the activities that Russia is undertaking actually matter from the perspective of the US. We know what Russia is doing, but not everything that Russia is doing in Africa actually matters. And I think as we look ahead in particular, we know that the Kremlin's in change, be it regarding Ukraine, be it regarding the US or NATO, is unlikely to change. So the things that truly matters is Russia's capability. And as we look at Africa, I think the more interesting question to ask, what from what Russia is doing in Africa is actually aiding Russia's capability? And I think there are three elements that I would put on kind of watch list. The first being activities that directly help Russia's defense industrial base, be it access to rare metals or sanction evasion pathways that it's building in Africa. Second, revenue streams that are directly aiding people in Putin's regime, because that's what Russia is using Africa for, in part, as we know, the heads of many state-owned enterprises, be it Rosatom or Alrosa, they're run by those in the regime. And the third one is using Africa to aid Russia's global information operations. And I think, as we look at U.S. policy going forward, it's not the question of what Russia is doing, even though we should watch all of that. It's what out of its activities in Africa actually help Russia's capability. And that's what we should be, in my assessment, focused on targeting while preserving our own interest.
Okay. Michael, we spoke about this a little bit last week, in Russia's information strategy, how effective they really are in some cases, and how ineffective the West seems to be. Why is that so? Why is that a weak spot for the West in terms of information, even the sort of public relations strategy across countries where it seeks to engage in Africa?
Well, I think it's imperative for us, broadly speaking, the West, the French, the Americans, to think about, well, why is Russian influence operation so successful? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of Africans, rightly or wrongly, have grievances against the West, or rather they're looking for ways to understand things. They have a long history. Certainly when you're talking about Francophone Africa, I mean, they have a colonial memory, colonial history. They're very well aware of post-colonial French policies. And they know in great detail all sorts of things that the French did during the 1960s, 70s, 80s. You can talk about neocolonialism, post-colonialism. A lot of it is very difficult to understand as an outsider trying to understand French interventions in the 1970s, 1980s. Often I'm baffled. I don't understand it, but it's very hard to understand how what the French were doing was in the interest of the local population. It's very hard to get that. It's for French interests, right? Which sometimes overlap with other people, but it's inscrutable. You've got a past, you have a memory. This is something that Africans themselves are very conscious of. And they have sort of long briefs against the West. And some of it's based on truth, right? There's a lot of truth to their grievances. Some of it's perception, some of it's exaggerated, some of it's misconception, some of it's conspiracy theory. But either way, it's real. And if we wish to understand, well, why is it that they're so willing to sort of follow through, or why they're so vulnerable, I guess, or interested in what the Russians seem to offer, it has to do with the fact that they already are kind of predisposed to view the West in some ways and to view the Russians with some ways. And what I urge, particularly to French audiences, is that they should, instead of blaming Russia for everything and giving Russia all this credit that I don't think Russia deserves, to be retrospective and introspective. Like, well, what have we been doing in the last 60 years that might have created this situation such that all these West Africans are kind of angry at us, right? Again, rightly or wrongly, but the truth is that they are, and we need to really listen, and we need to think about that. And then the other thing that I wish to stress, particularly for the Sahel, because I think is very relevant, is that I think a lot of Sahelians suffer from what I've taken to describing as a cognitive dissonance, meaning that their countries, Mali and Burkina Faso, are falling apart. Things are very bad, the situation is very bad, and they're struggling to understand why. Why is it that despite all the things that they like to believe about their countries and like to believe, the French were here doing a combat mission, and yet it's still really terrible. The UN is here, MINUSMA, it's huge, and yet it doesn't do anything. Trying to square what they believe about the way things should be with what they see day to day in the reality, in this sort of cognitive dissonance, they're sort of looking for answers, and in steps in certain kind of ideologies, which, like in a classic Marxist sense, serve to help to square this cognitive dissonance. And thus certain like Pan-Africanist style ideologies are really very useful. So blaming France, looking for scapegoats, this is very useful. But resorting to sort of older Pan-Africanist, leftist sorts of things. And in that world, also the Soviet Union historically has played a very positive role, at least according to people who think this way. So again, it's like we need to look very hard at why are people there so open to Russian influence rather than to give the Russians all this credit for the success of their influence operations.
Okay. Petter, I think you had a point there you wished to raise.
At the beginning, I just wanted to mention that from my point of view, there is a problem that we've been missing coordinated effort to create a counter-narrative. That was the only one, the Russians, and that it was everywhere. And once you control a few of the elites, political elites, who spread twice, 3 times a week pro-Russian information narrative, then it becomes really difficult. And that's where we have to take a lesson and do it another way.
Ovigwe, I don't want to neglect you. You're joining us again remotely. What contribution would you give us about that very idea we were just speaking about?
Yeah, I think the previous speaker that spoke about cognitive dissonance, he, to a large extent, really hit the nail on the head, because, see, you have to look at the West African context here, and let's not go back into colonialism, because that's a whole different conversation. Let's go back to 2010, 2011, when we saw, the almost, in fact, I would say complete fracture of the Malian state. Then the French, the launch of Operation Saval, which was actually, in fact, not even just in my opinion, if you look at all of the reviews of that operation, was very successful. It was able to, by 18 months, was able to repel the jihadists, and at least the Malian state maintain its control. And a lot of people came up to the streets to celebrate, President Francois Hollande, celebrate all of their achievements. And that's the kind of point I like to make in this type of conversations. The situations in this country are so dire that the result is needed today. You cannot wait. You just cannot wait. So if you look at what the military governments are saying, is we want to provide you with security now. We don't have time to talk about things like what are human rights, constitutional this, constitutional that. There's so many issues to deal with. But country like Burkina Faso, during the period you have Operation after Saval, there was Operation Barkhane, and MINUSMA was launched in 2013. Under this period, till 2022, Burkina Faso lost 40% of its, control of 40% of its territory. How can you explain to a Burkinabe person citizen that you had MINUSMA 15,000 plus, you had Operation Barkhane about 5,000, you have the G5 Sahel force, still yet your country lost 40%, control of 40% of its territory? Who is going to, in their right mind, is going to support such both the multilateral and all of those engagements? So that is the kind of context we're dealing with, and the problem is not just one of Russian misinformation. There is evidence for that, but there's a real context that really needs to be addressed if we are to really understand why there is such a revival, of pro-Russian sentiment and increase in anti-French sentiment. But where I begin to diverge from, or at least where I begin to criticize a lot what these governments in Mali, Burkina Faso and the likes are doing, is your security partnership has to speak to the totality of the security situation of the country. As it stands now, what the Russians are providing is more of kinetic rather than systemic solutions, right? So, and these are soldiers, so it will make sense to them, give them, see that in more weapons, military advisors, and even boots on the ground with Wagner, for instance. They want to get the job done now. Now, if we look at on TV on Burkinabe or Malian TV, the leaders are wearing military fatigues. They are not even out of combat mode yet. About a few weeks ago, the leader Ibrahim Traore in Burkinabe actually goes on the field to speak with the troops. So you have to understand the psyche, and there is a lot of what was a fundamental attribution error when Western analysts look at what is happening to, and they just say, no, these are military guys, so they don't have any respect for rule of law and all of that. No, it's an urgent situation, and that is why every time they promise that, and the pretext for their coups is that they have to fight the security is so urgent that they have to take urgent action. But like I said, what is needed is systemic solutions, and as of today, whether we're looking at even in CAR or in Mali and going to Burkina Faso, there is no evidence that the Russians working with these countries can provide the kind of comprehensive security solutions that this country needs.
Thank you, Ovigwe. Let's pick up that point then, and any of you please respond. There are clearly some grave difficulties in introducing systemic solutions. This is not an easy task. What sort of advantages or disadvantages does the West or the US in particular bring? And are they pursuing this in a productive way, pursuing long-term systemic solutions for countries in crisis?
I mean, honestly, we're bad at it. We do it, we try it, we're bad at it, but I don't know if anybody really has a secret sauce for how to do it, because ultimately the way to do it is by colonialism, right? You take over and you govern. That's not on the table. I'm not suggesting it should be on the table, but I'm saying that to actually fix governance involves intervening in such a way that's basically you're governing. So in light of the fact that that's not an option, then we're always finding ways, trying to figure out ways to sort of tinker on the margins and have workshops and engagement. We're always having, the embassies are always organizing meet and greets and workshops, and we're talking about democracy, and we're meeting with civil society, and it's all lovely, and certainly well-intentioned, but I don't see it as necessarily very effective. And this is part of the advantage of the Russians, because the Russians don't bother, right? And the Russians also are not, and it's very important, they're not looking to build anything. The Russians are just looking to spoil things. So they don't bother, they don't try, and they're as the speaker said, they're just really interested in, I hate the term, but kinetic solutions, right? They're just gonna have local security forces kill people. And that's what they do, and that's all they offer. And so, to a certain way, that's perversely, that's sometimes more satisfying for the countries that we work with, because we are tending to be a little bit preachy. And again, I'm not advising that we stop being preachy, because then if we sort of completely, we can be accused of hypocrisy, but I'd almost rather be a hypocrite than to sort of then be
purely cynical.
Purely cynical, right? Because sometimes we do the right things, or we often try to do the right things. It's just, it's hard for us as a government to try to actually come up with interesting, innovative, creative, and constructive programs, although we try, and I think that's important.
Natalia, in your view, is that entirely true, that the Russians are absolutely not there to build anything, but to disrupt?
I wouldn't say that they're there to disrupt. They're there with very concrete objectives they're trying to achieve on their own behalf, but they're certainly there not to build. I mean, they're nowhere to build, actually. Name me one place where Russians are engaging with the purpose to building, including, frankly, their own country. However, the larger point, actually, and this is where the war in Ukraine really matters, is the question of what Russia can offer going forward. Right now, there is some niche value proposition that Russia has to countries in Africa that it kind of amplifies with, again, information operation, investments in human network. But as we look ahead, and I think it's unclear yet which way to go, but the value, whether it's the weapons they can trade, the investment they can make, any other benefit you can think of, everything will likely diminish. They might still choose to prioritize some limited investments in Africa, but I think that's a very important question to ask. And The second point is, look, competing with Russia in Africa is not about Africa itself. The biggest competition point with Russia that will determine its entire global power is happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. If Russia keeps the gains in Ukraine, it will be able to rebuild, reconstitute its force, and the Russian narratives will gain, Russian global influence will likely have a chance to resurge. If it loses the gains, then it has, the switch works the other way. And Russia's global influence will diminish as well. So I think,
Can you dig into that a little bit more? Why, in an African government, why do they care? Why is Russia a much less attractive partner if it loses in Ukraine?
Because it would have less to offer. Now, some African governments might still not care about that. It's just the physical value proposition that Russia can wield in any place in the world and invest in its influence will grow. And right now, look, there is a gap between the perception Russia's trying to create and the real basis of power. What I'm trying to say is that gap is going to grow, and no amount of information operations will be able to close the gap between what Russia can offer and what it really is if it loses in Ukraine.
Okay. Do you have something to add on top of that?
Yeah, to your question, I'd say that the area where there is a chance that we can outcompete Russians is the investment. In military, I guess that Russians they can continue support the juntas or the governments for some time, and they can always claim, and the African sees it, that despite 10 years of other engagement, the security situation went not much better. Thus, with investments we see now in Mali, the promises are not fulfilled, and if this continues in year, 2 years' time, I think that the governments had to think twice. That without investments into infrastructure, without projects, the partnership with Russia is not sustainable for the governments. And I think that's the way we can find a way how to sneak in and get more influence.
In a couple of minutes, we're going to go to an audience Q&A, so I'd like to encourage more of our viewers and our audience here to think about some questions. But one last larger question for the panel before we do that. And keying off something you just said, Petra, about investments. And of course, Ovigwe was speaking about longer-term systemic solutions. And this comes back to something that came up in our first discussion earlier with the authors, the conditionality of Western engagement. Do the Western powers strike that balance correctly? Of course, we want to be principled. We want to be high-minded. We want to show good examples. But if too many conditions are attached, it ends up offering an opening as we withdraw from commitments. If the conditions are broken, then it offers an opportunity to Russia or others who have proven themselves, as you said, Petra, to be very optimistic. So, Michael, is that balance being struck poorly or well, as you see it?
It's being struck poorly, but I hesitate to say that because I don't have a better idea of what the recipe should be, right? This is this big quest. It's like trying to find green hydrogen or something, like something that we all want and know that would be amazing, but we don't know how to do it. And we strike a poor balance, and we also tend to be inconsistent in terms of how we apply the balance. You know, a great classic example is the fact that we're sometimes indulgent to autocrats, and we're sometimes critical of autocrats, right? And how do we manage this? You know, we're nice to Debbie, but we're not nice to the Malian junta, and what's actually the difference? And of course, Africans notice this, and they're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? We've yet to figure out how to do it. I don't think we should abandon conditionality, but I think we should always be trying to figure out and asking ourselves how better to do it, and being honest about the ineffectiveness of our past attempts to do it, and then trying to be creative about finding new ways. But I think we're all agreed, like, it would be really bad for us to just give up on it and just sort of approach a kind of almost a cynical approach to things. You know, they may end up basically being no better than the Russians.
Ovigwe, do you have anything? Also, again, don't want to neglect you on that point.
Well, for me, it's just a little clarification. When I talk about Russia not having systemic solutions. All solutions ultimately will have to come from within African countries, right? But you need capacity and commitment. Actually, your security partnership, should be able to provide some form of institutional capacity, because African countries need institutional solutions as well. So, for instance, you want to address, like national security strategy, development and implementation. You want to, address, the drivers of the conflict or even peace negotiation. That needs a lot of, collaborative effort, or even bringing multilateral partners to work that out. And also designing, a very sustainable collective security and crisis response for the region. Because, like I mentioned earlier, with all of the failed, G5 Sahel, Operation Barkhane, you need something that is sustainable, and this requires multiple partnerships. Now, where the current partnership these countries have with Russia is because they are close to Russia, other partners who are actually very critical to providing technical expertise. Nobody is asking you to come lecture. If nobody wants to hear anybody come sit down and from someone from Brussels lecturing you on how to govern your own country. But of course, we know you have experiences. So it's almost a decision of you coming to contribute your experience rather than saying this is how you should do it. Or else if you don't do it like this, I don't give you, development aid, or that kind of coercion. If you approach sincerely and respect the sovereignty of the people and the country, then everybody is a welcome partner to work with African countries to develop these solutions. The problem now is because Mali, Burkina Faso, not Burkina Faso, we don't know for sure yet, but they've chosen Russia. Almost every other of the major partners that they've been working with are not going to play into this sort of process. So they'll be very much constrained. I don't think the Russians have the financial commitment to pump hundreds of millions into like a conflict and stabilization operation in CAR or in Mali or in Burkina Faso or across the Sahel. So that is where it is very important that, and I said in my paper that I published, the security partnership, is high risk, low reward and limited impact. And you have regime security, but all of the other components that you need for national security and all the security sector reforms and the partners to work with are not going to work with you now because you've chosen to work with the rival. And these African countries really need to think this through, because after a point, the citizens are going to start asking questions. Okay, we've given the Russians about 5 years or 6 years or whatever, how long it takes. Where are the solutions on the ground?
Thank you. Now, I've got a few, any last points I should say, Natalia or Peter, before we take some questions? Okay. Apparently, audience questions will also be coming through on my tablet here. I think this is a good question, and feel free to jump right in, any of you. We cannot talk about Russia and Africa without mentioning China. And China did not really, came up a little bit. How do you think Russia's role in Africa is influenced by China's presence in the region, positively and negatively? Someone feel...
I can start with.
Okay.
I think 2 points. First, Russia doesn't directly compete with China at scale in Africa. First, because it can't, and second, because Russia's value proposition, once again, it's different, right? It's very niche, and it's focused on deliveries that authoritarian regimes care about. And we talked about physical security, food security, though that's being challenged, of course, this year. And stuff. I think, secondly, Russia's relationship with China and Africa is in the context of Russia's relationship with China, period. That's a strategically important ally for Russia, the one that I think Russia hoped it would rely a lot more on in its invasion of Ukraine. So Russia has been doing a lot, make sure to not damage that relationship in any way in Africa. Africa matters a lot less to Russia than its relationship with China.
Okay. Well, let me alter that question as well and pose it in a second way. How does the West have to think differently when it's countering Chinese influence in Africa as opposed to countering Russia?
Well, I mean, The thing is that it's a different, I think she's right, it's a different value proposition. And I don't think I can in good faith tell Africans that they should work with the Chinese, because the Chinese offer a lot of investment, a lot of good. It's a complex and it's a mixed bag. There's some good sides and some bad sides, but they often provide what Africans need and things that are good for Africa in terms of development and commerce and whatnot. Russia offers very different things, and I think it's just mindful. And this is also a reason why, like, I think hectoring Africans about China is completely ridiculous. Russia is different because, again, Russia is, my idea, like, Russia is not there to build necessarily. They're sort of there to do things to advance their own interests, but it's a very different kind of thing. And so I see them as very different cases, and they should be treated differently and understood differently, and certainly not thrown into the same basket when we're talking about these nefarious foreign actors that we're worried about in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would go even farther, not talking only about Russians and Chinese. There are other regional actors growing up, Turkey, Gulfies, and this makes a completely different environment for us, for Europeans. We've been used to come to the capitals, say, well, we want this, we will give you this, and that was the deal which was on the table, take it or leave it. Now you have 5, 6 powers competing for the influence. Africans are playing us against each other, and that's a new environment. We have to find new diplomatic tools to deal with. We still don't have, and that's something we have to take into consideration if we want to get stronger, get some influence, and keep it.
Okay. Another member of our audience asked a very simple question. In the context of all of this, in this power competition, what is it that Africans need and want? And does the West even really know or understand what it is that Africans want out of this? Are they trying hard enough to understand what Africans want?
Can I?
Go ahead. Ovigwe, do you have something on that?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's start with the last question. There is a lot of differences, and both three speakers spoke to it in terms of Russia, Africa, China, Africa relations. I mean, if you look at just even the trade figures, you have Chinese trade now in the neighborhood of 300 billion a year, and then Russia 15.6 billion in 2021. So it's hugely different in terms of economic weight. Security seems to be no competition, but in terms of politics, that's where there's a bit of synergy because if you understand how what Africa is saying, and this is now speaking to your second question about African countries wanting to play a bigger role in global affairs. We heard the Ethiopian Prime Minister speak to this very clearly in the last AU Summit 2022, not this one of this year. And even Macky Sall has spoken to this a lot. That's Senegalese president, former AU chair. The thinking in Africa is that there is very little room for Africa in the current Western-led system. And that is why you would see African countries talking about trying the ambition to join the G20. We've also still seen about reform of the UN Security Council. And then let's look at the countries who are actually vocal in this regard. If you go back to Bali last year, we saw President Xi Jinping saying that China supports Africa's ambition to join the G20. And then in December, just before the US-Africa Summit, President Biden came on board. We still don't even know what the Russians are saying in that regard yet. But if you then look at other issues around multipolarity and Africa's ambition. So with regards to BRICS and this new order that, of course, we know China and Russia are working in a very synergistic way to develop. Then you see South Africa is already a member, and we are hearing the Algerians want to join. The Egyptians are interested as well. Even my country, Nigeria, is interested as well. But of course, and so many other countries. So there might not, in Africa, with terms of Russia and China, there might not necessarily be clear economic or I would say security synergies, but in terms of politics, vis-a-vis Africa's global political objectives, there is, of course, alignment because African countries perceive this new order that these countries, Russia and China, are creating to be more beneficial, to their own interests. When by this, I remember I was talking to an African official at the Dakar International Peace, including African countries, but BRICS will expand to include us. So who do you think what we're thinking about when we're talking about profile on the world stage? So yeah, there you have it.
Thank you very much, Ovigwe, and thank you to all our panelists, Michael, Natalia, Petter, for a great conversation. And now it's my final pleasure to introduce former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs and an Atlantic Council board member, Franklin Kramer, who will give us some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel, to the report writers, and to all who spoke before, including Ambassador Yada. You've all heard this morning's discussion. It, I think, aptly characterizes Russia's engagement in Africa. And what I'd like to undertake in a very summary form is a comparison of that engagement with the engagement of the advanced democratic economies and offer a few recommendations for ourselves and for our close allies. I think as the discussions have made clear, Russia's engagement's heavily militarized. The report indicates arms sales, training, education, multiple discussions of the Wagner Group, in particular combat and combat support, and particularly with countries that have significant governance issues, including Libya, Mozambique, Mali, and the Central African Republic. Beyond the military, Russia's engagement with Africa includes trade of about $20 billion a year. Now, by comparison, Africa's engagement with the advanced democratic economies, and by that I mean the G7 countries, that's Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, and the US, plus also the European Union, Australia, Norway, and the Republic of Korea. That engagement with the advanced democratic economies is far greater. And without running through statistics for the entirety of this G7 plus, in 2022, US-Africa two-way trade was approximately $70 billion. So that's 3 times more than Russia trade. EU-Africa trade in 2021, that's the latest year for which I have statistics, was about $300 billion. So about 15 times Russia's trade. In Japan, Africa trade in 2021 was $23.5 billion. So again, larger than Russia's. And for those who are wondering, China-Africa trade was about $137 billion, about 1/3 of the advanced democratic economies, although China does also provide a lot of loans and foreign direct investment. So in sum, the engagement of the advanced democratic economies with Africa dwarfs that of Russia. And moreover, as the outcome from the recent US-Africa Leaders Summit indicates, with the US undertaking approximately $55 billion in initiatives across a variety of sectors, and to pick up from Sarah Daly's report, what that allows us to do is to focus, and I'm quoting, focus on proactive rather than reactive initiatives that strengthen and improve existing relations, and to design new programs around the needs and the goals of African nations. There was a reference to the importance of systemic approaches, and I'd like to take a look at what that might include. And I think undertaking that kind of approach provides true security for the people of Africa, because security is not only military, but it also encompasses economic security, it encompasses energy security, climate security, food security, and health security. So let me briefly offer a few ideas. Economic security and maybe a focus on infrastructure. Janet Yellen's recent trip to Africa was mentioned before. One of the focus areas that she looked at was Africa's infrastructure gap. That's estimated at about $100 billion annually. The G7, as she noted, has undertaken an initiative called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. It involves about $600 billion, of which the US will provide about $200 billion. A good portion of those funds should be directed to African infrastructure. Energy security, electrification, by way of example. The electrification deficit in Africa is well known, but Africa's potential for renewable energy, and by that I include solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, matches or even exceeds any other area of the world. Kenya already gets about 80%, slightly more of its electricity from renewables. The potential for the rest of Africa is equally high. Climate security. We had a mention of green hydrogen during the discussion. Climate security will depend in significant part on the role of green hydrogen for transportation, for steel making, other uses. Green hydrogen requires water and a green power source. Obviously, Africa has much of each. There is already an African Green Hydrogen Alliance, currently includes 6 countries: Egypt, Kenya, Mauritania, Morocco, Namibia, and South Africa. And more countries have the potential for producing green hydrogen. And let me finally talk about health security. There's a huge requirement for health workers in Africa. The ratio of health workers to population is far below that needed for essential health services. The WHO estimates that there are approximately 1.55 health workers in Africa per 1,000 people. That's as compared to what they say is the necessary standard of 4.45 health workers per 1,000. So a focused program that includes the requisite education and training would have enormous societal and humanitarian value. And finally, to close where this program focused, namely on military security, the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine underscores that Western military doctrine, Western organization, Western training, Western equipment are far more effective than that provided by Russia. Ukraine demonstrates also that the value of a country and its population leading its own defense is critical. But the United States, through Africom and other means of security cooperation, as well as working with allies, can provide highly valuable security assistance to African nations, as well as to multinational African military efforts. So in sum, an across-the-board collaboration, a systemic effort between and among the advanced democratic economies and the nations and institutions of Africa can provide a high level of security and enormous benefits to the peoples of Africa. And finally, let me close by thanking the report authors, the panelists, the moderator, Ambassador Yada, Major General Ekman. Thank you all, and thank you especially to the audience. Appreciate your being here. The reports will be online, and we look forward to your continued involvement in Atlantic Council events. Thank you very much.